when you walk with open arms towards the sun. You feel the warmth of the rays, and then you know you're alive, and you don't have to be afraid of anything, 'cause you know.
Welcome to the Bassline. Leslie Batts lost her husband Paul to the vicious hospital protocols that were imposed during the peak of the COVID event. She has courageously stood up on his behalf and on the behalf of all people of goodwill to make sure these crimes never happen again. It is with great appreciation that I welcome to the Bassline the brave Leslie Batts. How are you, Leslie?
I'm doing well, Jeremiah. Thank you for having me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. So a few quick announcements before we get into our discussion here. First of all, this Sunday at Rock Mill Fitness, we are moving forward with the 528 frequency jam session. They say there's going to be a big storm. We're hoping it's going to be one of these cases where they say big storm and it's just regular old snow. But we're doing the rain or shine thing, and we're going to be there. So if you can join us, please be one of those people who toughs it out, makes it through the snow to 274 Lenox Avenue, just south of 124th Street, just south of the 125th Street train station on Lenox Avenue. The 2 or the 3 will take you right there. It's a suggested donation, $10, and it's going to be another great time. We're going to be tuned to the 528 frequency. There's going to be African percussion. It's sort of an indigenous sound meets a contemporary sound, and I'll be playing electric bass. So please come through this Sunday if you can. The doors are 3:30 p.m., and we get jamming shortly thereafter. Second of all, I have a new Substack article. Please go and check it out. It's called The Macroscopic Lens, and it's a look at COVID from a global perspective. It's my third interview with a very unique AI system. It's unlike any AI you've come across. It's called Alter AI. And please check that out at Substack. You can go to jeremiahhosea.substack.com, and it will take you right to my Substack account. Also, of course, you can purchase music, like, for example, the theme song of this show, Love's the Highest Truth, at jeremiahhosea.com. That's jeremiahhosea.com. I'm a chess teacher, so you can schedule a chess lesson with me either directly at my email, which is jeremiahhosea@gmail.com, or remotelearningchess.com is the website, and you can click on a link there that will send you to the same email address, basically. And a new thing that we have here on the Bassline is I'm now an affiliate for frontierfarm.com. So that's spelled FRONTIERPHARM.com. Discount code The Bassline, and remember that's BASSLINE. I think the code is with the space in between the two words. It's the space Bassline. And they are a leader in providing chlorine dioxide products. So I, of course, am not a medical professional. I don't make any claims as to treatments or cures, but they have a wide array of products, and many people swear by their products. They provide mouthwash, they provide skin care, things to treat ear infections, things for internal use as well as topical application. And I have a lot more to learn about chlorine dioxide, but it seems to be part of a new wave of self-care whereby we can have useful and helpful prophylactics on hand that prevent us from needing to go to the doctor's office or the hospital, which some people also call the hellspital. And we want to stay out of there as well as we can. So please take a look at that. Frontier Farm with a PH, FRONTIERPHARM.com. Discount code The Bassline. And yeah, take a look at those products. It's a good company, and I was invited to be an affiliate by some really good folks, including actually specifically my good friend and co-host on Stop the Shot, CC Blakeman. The American Granddaughter. Go check out her spectacular podcast on Rumble. But we have a very serious discussion today. Our guest lost her dear husband to the vicious protocols, as I described in the introduction. And it's just an unbelievable story what this woman has endured. And it really raises the question of what the hell was going on in hospitals that led to such an inordinate level of COVID death in our country. I mean, our country is not even 4% of the world's population, but we constituted over 20% of the world's death. How could that be? And I think some of those answers will be found in this conversation. So let's just get right into this, Leslie. If you could tell us, and just take your time in doing so, what happened to your husband? Tell us everything that we need to know.
Well, and see, that's the tricky question, isn't it? Because there were no witnesses. There was no one there that could actually see what happened to him. So now what we're left with is simply the medical records. I can tell you what I speculate happened based on what I found in those records, but it raises a more serious problem that no one seemed to be able to, how do I put this, hold them accountable when it was actually happening.
Right.
So if you don't know what's happening, you can't stop it, right? But what I found in the medical records was I had actually spoken with the doctor. I had spoken with my husband, and we had all made it perfectly clear that he did not want to be intubated. They were supposed to put the information on the medical record, but it was never documented. So he went into the hospital very, very late on October 9th, 2021. Was transferred from the hospital. I assumed he was going to get a breathing treatment and maybe some oxygen, and he'd come walking out, and I'd take him home. But I get a phone call from the nurse saying he's getting transferred to a level 3 ICU. I said, is he in acute distress? She says, no. But just in case he decompensates, we want to make sure he's receiving a higher level of care. I said, okay. And he apparently agreed to it. I told her, well, I'm going to bring his charger back up so that he has his phone. We can communicate. She says, you won't have time. They're flying him by helicopter an hour away. It's like, why is he going by helicopter if he's not in any acute distress? She says, well, just in case he decompensates, they can't intubate him in an ambulance. And I said, he's not going to be intubated, for one. He's made it perfectly clear to you, to me, to everyone, that he will not be put on a vent. And I don't see the urgency that requires the necessity for a helicopter. But she said, well, it's just our policy with COVID. I said, okay. The next thing I know, he's at the hospital at the ICU. I'm on the phone with the ICU nurses saying he doesn't want to be put on a ventilator. Place a DNI on the chart. He's told you he doesn't want to be intubated. And we will go from there. They agreed. Everything seemed fine. 24 hours later, he and I are still contacting each other through text, phone, video calls, all that. Through the night of the 10th. And then on the morning of the 11th, I never hear from him. There's no call. There's no response to my text messages. He's not answering his phone. And I started to get a little concerned, so I started calling the nurse. They said, no, he's doing fine. He's eating breakfast. I'm sure he'll reach out to you later. By that evening, he's still not really responsive. But the last communication I received from him was at 12:40 on the 11th that said, they won't stop asking me about intubation, and I'm starting to lose my cool. At that point, I start calling the hospital saying, wait, you're supposed to have a DNI order on his chart. I contact the hospital administrator, no answer. I contact the patient advocate and said, this isn't okay. I start working on trying to get him out of there, because this is now starting to throw up huge red flags. I called them. I said, I'm coming to pick him up. And they said, if you come to this hospital, you'll be arrested. Now, we had an 8-year-old son at the time. We had no family. I had no one there to take care of my son, so I couldn't risk going to jail. And I'm thinking, well, he's a big, strong guy. Maybe he can take care of himself until we can figure something out. At least maybe he can get out or something. I got a phone call from the doctor immediately following that text message saying, well, we're doing everything we can to keep him off of a ventilator, but, that conversation started with, Miss Batts. I said, yes. He said, I hope you're vaccinated, because your husband's getting ready to go on a ventilator for a month, and then he's going to be in rehab for a year if he survives, and you need to be alive to take care of him. And I said, well, who is this? He said, well, this is his doctor. I said, not with that attitude. You're fired. And he said, well, you can't fire me. I'm the only critical care pulmonologist here that can take care of your husband. I said, well, we'll see about that. So that was the last communication I received from my husband. What I found out in the medical records was they actually started sedating him early that morning and trying to pressure him into getting ventilated. And as he was refusing and getting argumentative about it, they started increasing his sedation. So by the time that text message came through, he was at a moderate dose of Precedex. Immediately following that text message that I received from him, the sedation level increased till he was on immobilized patient protocols, which means he was basically asleep. He was sedated. 24 hours later, I'm still contacting the nurses. They're telling me now that he's awake and he's eating his dinner, watching TV, but he's just refusing to speak to me. He doesn't want to talk to me at all. By 12:30 on the 12th, I get a phone call from the doctor saying, your husband is ready to be intubated and we want you to give consent. I said, no, I will not give consent, and I don't believe you. So I called my husband's phone on video, and for the first time in over 24 hours, the phone is answered. I see my husband with a BiPAP mask on, but I can't understand anything he's saying. And it appears that his hands are restrained, that he's tied to the bed. But I can't see his hands. All I know is I can see his face, but the phone is so far away that he's clearly not the one holding it, and I can't see his hands. The video call lasts 31 seconds, and we're disconnected. And immediately the doctor calls me back, pressuring me to give consent to intubation, and I continue to refuse. I said, well, if he's giving you consent, that's not what I heard. I couldn't understand him. But if he's giving you consent, there will be a consent form signed on his medical record. And you don't need my consent anyway. So I hung up with the doctor, and I found out in the medical records 2 minutes after that call ended, they administered an excessive dose of paralytic, which put him into respiratory arrest. And he was intubated 6 minutes later. From that point, I have no idea what really happened. There's no notes from any of the nurses. There's almost no doctor's notes in the medical record. And the only thing that is documented between the 11th and the 14th is the intubation. And it doesn't give any reason why he's being intubated. It doesn't mention anything about the conversation that we had or him calling me or my husband even saying that he had given consent. It simply says patient is now intubated. I'm still trying to find a way to get him out of that hospital. I'm calling around to every hospital I can find, trying to get him transferred, and they won't let him go. I've then am creating such a problem calling administration and the advocates that the doctor finally calls me and asks me if I'd like to come visit my husband now that he's on a ventilator. All of a sudden, I'm welcome. I'm not sure why I couldn't come before and I'd be arrested, but now, come on in. And he's stable for 2 days. And then according to the medical record, again, I've never been told any of this by anybody from the hospital, but according to the medical record, it appears he woke up and he pulled the tube out because nobody was paying attention to his sedation level. They re-intubated him, re-paralyzed him, and then the doctor ordered an excessive sedation goal. They literally intentionally overdosed him until he had no brain activity. And he passed away on October 20th, 2021.
Wow. I'm so sorry for what you've been through. This is just a terrible story. And
it is, but it's not unique.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I have to say, I mean, I've hosted this program for over 2 years, and we've covered protocol, death, and the protocol issue previously, although I thought it was important that we provide more coverage of this really important aspect of the whole, what I call the COVID event. And that's why I specifically wanted you as a guest. And as I listen to your story, and as I try to wrap my head around this, I can't. I mean, it's impossible to understand. I mean, it sounds to me, from what I've heard you describe just now, but also from your previous interview that you sent me that I listened to in preparation for this discussion, this seems like murder. I mean, this seems so intentional. I mean, how does this happen? I mean, people who went to medical school and were trained to care for people just suddenly functioning as murderers. And I don't say that lightly, but it really appears to me that these harmful actions were done quite intentionally. This just seems to go beyond the scope of negligence. And I mean, I think there's several examples of that. Could you respond to that? I mean, don't you get the feeling that this was an intentional action on their part? They don't sound like people who are trying to care for a patient.
Well, it doesn't, does it? When you think about what your expectations are for your bodily autonomy and the rights that you think you have to your self-determination, all of that sort of went out the window the minute people walked into a hospital. I don't know all of the whys and what fors. I don't claim to. But my speculation is that when the mandate, because the stories that I've heard and the people that I've connected with, the majority of them were in the fall and winter of 2021, early 2022. And if you think back on it, that's when the mandates had really started going into effect for the vaccine. If you were a healthcare worker, you either got vaccinated or you got out. And what happened to be left in the hospitals at that point was either people that took it begrudgingly or they took it believing that it was the right thing to do. And if you remember back, we had all of this propaganda that was happening, and I call it the fear porn. But you had late night TV shows talking about, you know what, if you're not vaccinated, you don't deserve to live. You don't deserve treatment. We had people talking about clubbing baby seals. I'm sure you've heard that reference. We had people talking about, if you don't get vaccinated, you want your grandmother to die. So they had literally turned the unvaccinated into a scourge on humanity, that we were less than human, that we didn't deserve to receive the same level of care anyway. So it's kind of set up this whole worst case scenario. And then you throw on top of that the PrEP Act protections, or at least the perception of the PrEP Act protections, where they believe it doesn't really matter what they do, there's nothing that can be held against them. And you have this perfect storm. And in that perfect storm, there are levels, right? You've got levels of paranoia, you've got levels of fear, you've got all of these different places where people are at that we can't communicate, at least not effectively. So when you think about the intentionality and why someone would do something like that, or if it would even be something that they could do, I don't think people were operating at a level of sanity. I guess, for lack of a better expression, people were not sane. Now, whether it was intentional or whether it was incidental, the whole atmosphere just got turned into a boiling pot. You know, they started slow, and they generally just sort of gently just sort of turned up the heat until all of us were in this situation where we didn't realize we were already being cooked. And if you look at the numbers, as of September of 2023, I think it was 1.2 million people that were claimed to have died from COVID. But when you break that down by where those deaths occurred, approximately 114,000 out of 1.2 million died outside of a inpatient care facility, whether that's a nursing home, a hospital, or some, hospice center or something like that. And of those 114,000 people, those deaths were declared by a post-mortem PCR test. Now, unless you had a witness there to say, yes, he was very sick with COVID, we know that they were falsifying death records simply based on a positive test. So if somebody had died from a heart attack, but they happened to have a positive PCR test, that death was listed as COVID. Or if they fell and they hit their head and happened to have a positive PCR test, then that death was listed as COVID. So of those 114,000, we don't even really know how many of those people would have actually succumbed to a novel virus, or how many of them just happened to test positive. So when you look at the numbers, all of the COVID deaths almost exclusively happened inside of a hospital. And that has to tell you something. They weren't taking our neighbors out in body bags. You weren't seeing the homeless dying on the street corners from COVID. It all happened inside of a facility where there were no witnesses. There could be no advocate.
Yeah, that's
it's traumatizing.
Yeah, those are great points that you make. And when you describe it like that, it seems like a systemic murder operation. It seems like something really terrible was happening systemically in our country. I mean, aside from the cultural atmosphere that you described, this is unique compared to even other countries that experienced whatever extent of COVID mortality. We had such a disproportionate amount of the global deaths, and a lot of it seems to stem from this issue of these outrageous and destructive protocols. So considering all that you've been through, have you initiated any legal action? And if not, do you intend to do so?
Well, again, that's where it kind of gets tricky, because with the PrEP Act, all of the courts seem to have their doors closed to anything related to COVID. There was no opportunity really to file lawsuits because attorneys wouldn't take cases. They wouldn't even, the minute you said COVID, the door was closed. Not to say you don't have a case, but we can't help you kind of thing. So I started trying to get really, really creative from the very beginning. The first thing I did was try to go file a police report for battery, because under the definition of the definition under the statute for battery in Oklahoma, he met all of the criteria. It was offensive touching against his will. He was, harmed by the offensive act. And I have hours upon hours of recorded phone calls and personal interviews with police departments, because Oklahoma is a one-party state, where I'm trying to explain that this was battery, and their response is, well, we're not doctors, we can't investigate. I said, what do you mean you're not a doctor? You don't have to be a doctor. He said no, I said no, they did it anyway. That seems pretty straightforward. I don't think you need a medical degree to be able to see that. And they said, well, it happened in a hospital, though. I said, and that's relevant how? I said, if it had happened on the street, you would go arrest him immediately? He said, well, yeah. I said, but because it happened in a hospital, you can't touch them? He said, well, if it happened in a hospital, it's medical, and we're not doctors. I said, there's something seriously wrong with that logic. I said, so if they walked into the hospital room with a gun and put a bullet in his head and said, that's the latest COVID treatment, would that be okay? And he said, well, you're apples and oranges here. It's not the same thing. I said, well, it really kind of is, because instead of a gun, they carried a syringe. And instead of a bullet, it was a drug. But it's basically the same principle here. And he said, well, I'm so sorry that I can't help you. I had police officers tell me that I could write a complaint, but they wouldn't issue a complaint number or file it. They would just toss it in the trash. And then I went to the health departments, and they said, well, it's not really our job. We just kind of make sure that the hospital has so many beds per patient or beds per room or what have you. That's all we really do. And then I went to the medical board, and the medical board said, we don't see any actionable violations because we're bound to the Allopathic Act, and the Allopathic Act really only says that you can be held accountable if you commit a sexual assault as a patient towards a doctor, if you're prescribing drugs inappropriately, or you're practicing medicine without a license, or you're using drugs while you're practicing medicine. That's really the only guidelines under the Allopathic Act. So killing a patient doesn't fall under those guidelines. I went to the nursing board. Nursing board said, you can file a complaint, but we're not going to tell you whether or not we investigate it. I went to the pharmaceutical board and said, hey, how is it that they can put all of these narcotics in their system and administer them without any dosing instructions? Because, that's kind of like handing somebody a bottle of OxyContin without any label on it. Just saying, here, take it whenever you want, however you want. It's not our problem. And they said, well, yeah, they didn't understand that, and they'd never seen anything like that before, but there weren't any violations that they could hold them to. I went to CMS and said there were violations of the Code of Federal Regulations, conditions of participation. They just sent me back to the health department and said they're the ones who do our audits. So finally what we ended up doing was taking all of the evidence that we had collected and filing criminal complaints at the Attorney General's office with a petition requesting an investigation. And it's been sitting on his desk for over a year now. with a letter from a medical expert saying it was premeditated murder, with a probable cause affidavit for crimes, including kidnapping, battery, and in Oklahoma, it meets the criteria for felony murder. But he has chosen not to investigate. I was told it was sent to the grand jury unit, but I can't get any verification on that. When I do an open records request, they tell me that there's no responsive documents, even though I have a letter saying it went. And now what we're working on is trying to get legislation in the state of Oklahoma, and so far it's only Oklahoma. I am happy to provide a roadmap to any other state that would like to start working on this. But in Oklahoma, I was able to establish a legal argument that the statute of limitations for malpractice never began because we couldn't get attorneys, because there was a procedural bar or a belief of a procedural bar, and that attorneys didn't believe that they had the opportunity to file cases. So we're working on getting that legislation in this session, and we're going to have an event on February 24th at the Capitol to try to show support. And I'm hoping that this opens the door to some discovery, legal discovery, that we can start getting the answers to some of these questions and maybe hopefully providing some justice to people.
Yeah. Unbelievable. So I would like to ask you personally, I mean, first of all, I think it's, it's just really important that this gets documented. So it's really great that you have had the courage to speak out and to continue to speak out. But as you just stated, you've been sort of stonewalled by the legal system, which seems to be another part of this apparatus of death. They seem to have all their bases covered, in a sense. They propagandize us through these talk shows and through the corporate media. The protocols are carried out so viciously, and then you turn around and both the police and the larger legal system have no recourse and have really nothing to say about it. What motivates you to continue speaking out, and what would... I even use the term justice reluctantly, because my father told me that justice is a dubious concept, and I think he was right about that. But, I mean, what could even resemble justice at this point, considering what you've been through?
Acknowledgement, an apology. But what motivates me is I have a child, and it started out as anxiety and fear. If I have to take him to a hospital, what's going to happen to him? Do I lose control? Do I lose custody? But it grew into something much bigger. Because if you look back, even at Nuremberg, I hear a lot of people calling for Nuremberg 2.0. And this is where I get very emotional. And I apologize for that. But when I hear people talking about Nuremberg 2.0, the idea is removed from reality. When you think about it, 19 people were ever actually convicted for the horrendous, atrocious crimes that were committed. Millions of crimes that were committed. 19 people actually got convicted. And the idea of it was supposed to prevent that kind of thing from happening again, but here we are. So what my goal is at this point is not holding the Anthony Fauci's of the world accountable. Because that's just like, going back to those 19 people. It's the people that take the orders. It's the doctors and nurses that are supposed to stand in the gap and protect their patients. If they had refused to do these things, it wouldn't have happened. We all have to have some personal responsibility in this, and personal accountability. If they had stood up, it's just like the vaccine. If everyone had just said no, there would be no injuries. If everyone had just said, no, I am not going to put this patient on a ventilator if he doesn't need it, Or, no, I'm not going to give this patient remdesivir because I don't even know what this stuff does. If they had stood in the gap, we wouldn't have lost those folks. So for me, accountability looks like the doctors and the nurses being willing to stand and say, this isn't right. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry it happened. I'm sorry I put that injection in your arm. I'm sorry I put your loved one on a ventilator. I'm sorry I injected their veins with poison. And knowing that the system changes enough that the ones who can make a difference have the courage to make the difference. It's not about sending people to prison. It's not about money. It's about not allowing it to happen again. Losing our humanity. You know, I look at this truly as a battle of good and evil. Because if you're willing to sacrifice someone else's life for a principle that you believe you might be saving someone's grandmother without any proof or evidence of that at all, we need to reevaluate where we stand as a as a community and as a civilization. And that kind of gets to me because we all know what happened during COVID. Even the people that believed they were doing the right thing and that there was this, we can't even agree whether or not there was a virus. We can't even come up with common language as to what really happened. You know, some call it a bioweapon, some call it a virus. We can't even standardize the idea of what we went through. And being able to have a conversation with somebody and not even have a common language to speak is very difficult. And the misinterpretation and the division and all of that. So, sorry, I kind of go off into left field a little bit, but we have so many people that aren't even asking questions about all of the horrible things that happened and all of the damage that was caused. People losing their homes, people losing their livelihoods, people losing their businesses, people losing their loved ones and their families. And they're like, oh, well, you know, we're sorry, but that's over and done with. Nobody's even asking what happened. Nobody that has the ability to get the answers anyway. There's one or two people, maybe Rand Paul. I know Thomas Massey's, you know, had a bill over the PrEP Act. But doesn't that tell you something? That if something this horrendous and atrocious can happen, and the people that are supposed to protect us and care about what happens to our country aren't even having a conversation about it, either leads me, one, to believe that they already have the answers, so they don't need to ask the questions, or two, they just don't want to know. So, I don't know where we go from here, but it's going to be up to us, the individuals, to stand in the gap and protect each other, because clearly it's not going to come from any higher up.
Yeah. Well, you said a lot of wise words there, and a lot of insightful words. And I wrote an article recently called Clue, and it's addressing what you were mentioning there in terms of there's a lot of fundamental questions that remain unanswered about this COVID thing. And I'm amazed that people will gloss over this or try to put this in the rear view mirror when we're still witnessing excess deaths as a result of the shots. We still have this total lack of justice in regard to the protocol victims. And, amazingly, I mean, weren't you amazed, for example, when there was suddenly talk now about this term that was new to most of us, gain of function. And the very same people who are so animated by this idea of COVID floating around in the air, you're not fascinated by and concerned about gain of function research that might have created all of this. It was like, my analogy for that is like if you walk into a room and see a dead body on the ground, immediately saying, well, it doesn't matter if they were murdered or they just died. If they're dead, there's nothing we can do about it. Let's just clean up the body. It's like, well, the fact of whether they were murdered or not is absolutely paramount to what's happened here. But yeah, this it almost seems like an intentional lack of curiosity, like almost, pretending that something that is obviously so important is something we should forget about. It's such a strange psychological phenomenon that we're living through.
Yeah, and that's why I said, either they aren't asking the questions because they already have the answers, or they're not asking the questions because they've been told not to, or they don't care.
Yeah. We are a community radio station. Progressive Radio Network has a very intelligent community of listeners, and I'd like to invite you guys to call in if you have a question for my guest, Laura Batts. The phone number here, of course, is 888-874-4888. That's 888-874-4888. We'd love to hear from you. But in the meantime, Leslie, can you tell us, is there any way that people can support your efforts? Is there any way that we can help? What can people do to support what you're doing?
We do have a website with a petition, and the goal is getting that petition to a level where we can take it to Congress in its entirety. The goal is to eliminate any immunity at the federal level for anything. It's all unconstitutional. The 1986 Vaccine Act, the PrEP Act, the Patriot Act, which provides immunity for, some other horrible things that the government can do. And
hello?
Yes.
I'm just wondering, I heard another voice there. I don't know if that was a listener who got through. But sorry, go ahead, Leslie.
And one of the other things that we really need to look at is repealing the Smith Modernization Act. And I don't know if you or your listeners are real familiar with that, but that is what allowed our government to subject our own country to propaganda. That's what let them get away with a lot of this. So I think that's vital as well.
Yeah, and could you repeat that website, please?
www.right, RIGHTTO, remedy, REMEDY.com.
Excellent. Well, I also want to mention, before we go to our caller, that I wrote an article called James Roguski is Right. It's Time to Repeal the PrEP Act. And I'd ask you to please check out that article. Please sign the petition that's linked in the article. That's something that we can all do to start to address this, is to say we don't want these kinds of documents over our heads. We don't want to be put in this position of being victimized legally because of these unreasonable documents that put us in this precarious and unfair, and I'd say dehumanizing position. We have a call that I'd like to take right now. We have Andrew from New Jersey. How are you, Andrew?
Hello. Hello there.
Go ahead, sir.
Hi. I just had a thought when you was talking about all these atrocities. It seems to me almost like people don't want to admit their guilt or their responsibility because they're so shamed by what they did just came across my mind, and I was just wondering what you think about that. It's just like a universal kind of like denial guilt.
What do you think, Leslie? I mean, is it just denial?
I agree.
And guilt?
No, I think people never want to admit that they're wrong. It kind of goes against our basic nature. You know, if we can make mistakes and be fooled things, then it's detrimental to our survival. So we really don't want to think that it's possible. And I agree. I think denial is a huge part of what happened to a lot of these healthcare workers in the hospitals. And that's one of the reasons I think that they want to come forward as whistleblowers.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, it's a fundamental, kind of straightforward point. But yeah, denial, guilt, those are huge features of the human psyche. And it seems to be a big part of this. So thank you for that call, Andrew. Leslie, so you're in Oklahoma, and I envision that most of the South, or south of New York for sure, they weren't as susceptible to some of the propaganda that we were exposed to here in New York. But it doesn't seem much better, frankly, upon your description. So, I mean, what's the feel in the state of Oklahoma about all of this? I would expect, good old folks from Oklahoma to really take issue with this kind of human rights violation, constitutional rights violation. What's the scene?
And I hope so. I mean, I currently live in Florida, because after losing my husband, I had no family there. I had no safety net, and my anxiety level was through the roof. So I came back to my home state of Florida, where I have family, that just in case anything happened to me, my son has a safety net here. But I hope that the people in Oklahoma will be willing to stand with us and say, look, this bill is important to us. It restores our basic right to be able to receive the ability to get a remedy for what has been done. And when you think about the Constitution, our constitutional rights, the First Amendment, the Seventh Amendment, and the 14th Amendment all guarantee you the right for some type of remedy, whether it's redressing your government's grievance, which is interpreted as filing a lawsuit, whether it's, the Seventh Amendment that says you have the right to a jury trial in any matter that exceeds $20, or whether it's the 14th Amendment right to due process. All of these constitutional rights that we believe we have are kind of set to the side a lot of the time. I don't know how they get away with it, other than people don't call them out on it, but they do. So I'm hoping that the people of Oklahoma will be willing to come out on the 24th and stand with us and say it's important to us that we have this bill passed so that the constitutional rights that we believe we have are upheld.
Absolutely. So can you give the information for the 24th, if anyone possibly is in the area?
It's going to be from 2 to 5 p.m. on February 24th at the Oklahoma State Capitol, second floor rotunda.
Okay, so everyone, please spread the word about that. Even if you're not in Oklahoma, we have social media. There are ways of promoting events that are outside of your region, outside of your state. And I think it's really important that we take an international approach and support all the people all around the country, all around the world who are speaking out about this. And that's another thing that we can do to help, is don't think that,
yes,
if you can't go there personally, that you can't support the effort.
And we will be putting out a call to action when this gets stalled in a committee or something. you don't have to be in the state of Oklahoma to call and put pressure on those legislators and lawmakers to make sure it keeps moving through the process.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'd like to convey to the audience, we only have a few minutes left, and I just want to make it clear that we have a lot of resources in terms of truth. We have, for example, The Real CDC by John Bodwin. I've interviewed John on this program twice. Everyone get a copy of his book. You just go to therealcdc.com. And just to make it clear, when it comes to, for example, the vaccine issue, which we focus on quite a bit here, we have proof at this point of the harm that's been done, just to be clear, despite the efforts to obfuscate and to deflect and muddy the waters. We have the record level source data provided by John Bodwin showing a clear spike in deaths since the vaccine rollout, for example. We have full-length documentaries where the vaccine injured are testifying firsthand about their own experiences, the vaccine bereaved. We have even linguistic forensics at this point. I refer you back to my interview with Steve Bennett, who did linguistic forensic analysis of obituaries showing a sudden increase and a clear increase in the usage of the term aggressive cancer, for example, or died suddenly or died unexpectedly. It seems that we also, however, need to make sure, as we're doing here today, that we don't leave the protocol victims behind, because that's a huge aspect of all that happened here. Are there any documentaries that you're aware of, Leslie, that deal specifically with the protocol deaths? Is there anything that people can refer to get more information about specifically that topic?
VAX3 had a portion that was dedicated to the protocol victims. There was a movie called Bad Medicine that was supposed to be coming out, but it has never been released. So there's not really a whole lot out there. I know there's a couple of organizations, Protocol Kills and that kind of thing, that tell these stories. But we're still a topic that's so taboo, no one will talk about it. And when you start to talk about it, you get silenced. It's interesting how spaces get shut down when you start talking about protocols. Anything related to, even on X, the platform of free speech, you are so throttled and held back every time you start to mention this, that it's almost impossible to get the information out there. And I will say that, protocol victims and vaccine injuries and vaccine victims go hand in hand. I really believe that they needed the body count to force the fear to promote the vaccine. And they needed the body count to justify the EUA for the vaccine. So I think that they're more aligned than they're not. And I would, speaking of the vaccine injured, I'd actually reached out to Harry Fisher to be able to come and talk about some of his experiences on the 24th at the event. He's going to check his schedule, and he may be able to be there.
Yeah, you make a great point there, that the two issues are inextricably linked. And my interview is with Harry's AI system. A friend of his developed it, and it's really a phenomenal AI tool. You can go to alter.systems, just alter.systems, look that up, and it's an incredible resource. You can ask a question to this AI that, unlike the other AIs I've come across, it's not a pharma shill. I call these AI systems, they're technological shills, basically, because they cover up the truth in an unbelievably diligent way.
Oh, they absolutely do. I've actually been told by Grok that Grok couldn't answer some of those questions. Not because it didn't have the information, because I know the information is out there, but because it wasn't able to discuss those topics.
Now that's telling.
Mm-hmm.
So we are out of time, everyone. The hour has flown by, and it was a difficult conversation, but a necessary conversation. And I ask that you share the link to this interview, and please just support this movement as well as you can, because we can't go quietly into the night about all of these injustices. And I want to thank you, Leslie, for your courage and for taking the time to join us today. And please keep me aware of any way in which I can support your efforts, because I think you're doing a really tremendous job honoring your husband and protecting your child. So
that's the goal.
Everyone have a great weekend. Come through on Sunday if you're in or around New York City. It's gonna go down. We're gonna have our 528 jam session, even though it will be snowing apparently. And everyone stay strong. Keep fighting the good fight. Check out my new Substack, and we'll see you guys next week. Peace and love.